Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out live onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room televisions. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio producer. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. And especially big welcome to anyone out there who is new to the studio. And for those of you, here's a little bit more about what we do. The studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol, and we're a home for early stage ideas and companies and a meeting place of both the creative and commercial industries. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, and it's all for free for our residents. Ultimately, we offer a safe place for artists, companies and creatives to take risks in their practice and make time for unexpected collaboration. This week's talk is called Democracy, Theatre and Race and is by studio resident Javad Alipoor. Javad is an artist and writer and his recent work for theatre includes Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran and The Believers Are But Brothers. Both opened at the Edinburgh Fringe where they won Fringe First awards. Rich Kids was due to transfer to London to the Battersea Arts Centre before the pandemic, and Believers transferred to Bush before touring nationally and internationally for over 3 years. In this talk, Javad will set out the ideas inspired by his recent work on a manifesto for his company and ask how theatre and digital art might just be able to contribute to the big political questions of the 21st century. Quick content warning, the talk will mention racist violence and colonialism. It will touch on the Grenfell Tower fires and there'll be some images and a video of violent protests and some of the things I've just mentioned. Next week's talk is, well, actually, there is no talk next week as we're taking a well-earned week off and we'll be back on the 14th of August with Can Games Be Serious, which is by studio resident Claire Morwood and Chella Ramanan of Threefold Games, who will be introducing their recently released video game Before I Forget. More on that you can find on our website. For this talk, there's a Q&A at the end with the talk running at roughly 35 minutes. If you want to ask questions, just pop them into the chat window and I'll pick them out to ask as we go. You can drop those into the comments, but you will need to be signed into a Gmail or YouTube account in order to do that. If you can't do that, do tweet us at PM Studio UK and I'll pick them up as we go. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will be available here after the talk is finished. You can get news on all our future talks by following us on @PM Studio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget, whilst you're sat there listening to me talk, do hit subscribe on this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get and the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please feel free to share this link now as we're live on any of your social media channels. For now, I'm going to hand over to Javad.
Thank you. My name is Javad Alipoor, like Luke was saying. I am an artist and a writer. I'm a very political person. I'm still involved in bits of political activism that inform my work, and it's a sort of part of who I am. I've worked across theatre and film at different scales and doing different kinds of work. The director part of me is slightly annoyed by the way these chats often work, and like the way that you end up with like your notes over here and your camera over there, so you end up sort of playing things quite weirdly. But this is where we are. I'm someone who, like, politics and certain political commitments are really, really central to my work. As Luke was saying, I'm probably best known for a couple of shows that are called Rich Kids, History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, and The Believers Are But Brothers, both of which are shows that are about the intersection, if you like, between contemporary everyday digital technology and like big political questions. So Believers was about effectively like really about misogynist masculine violence and how that is being weaponized by the alt-right and ISIS, frankly, to sort of make substantial challenges to kind of post-war liberal democracy. And Rich Kids was about the Anthropocene, climate change, and the kind of collapse of the post-colonial nation states that were built after the West left left insofar as they left in the Middle East. As I say, I'm quite a political person, and my political commitments do kind of interact with my work quite a lot. I was one of the founders of the Syria Solidarity Movement. I've been really active in groups that try and support EU migrants whilst Brexit is going on and so on. And I suppose, in a way, like my way into this discussion is to talk about a little bit where I think we are at in terms of political art and political theatre, and then make a few provocations I would like to do before sharing a bit of my thinking about my own manifesto for my new company, the Javad Alipoor company. And just, I'd be really interested to see what people sort of think about that, really. So one of the place I'll begin is by saying that we sometimes talk in, especially from the point of view of theatre, people will often talk at the moment about living through a renaissance of political theatre, especially just before the lockdown. So, people might, this phrase was kind of thrown around a little bit. And for me, political theatre means many things to many people. I think to a lot of very powerful people, it primarily means largely white guys called David, writing quite, what would you call it, ruminative plays about the fall of the Soviet Union. But I think there's a broader definition of that. One of my frustrations with a lot of that chat is a lot of work that I see as political art at the minute, I look at and I think its politics aren't that deep, and it's not necessarily that interesting as art. Because I think sometimes we end up, because as artists, we care about our art so much, we don't end up doing any politics other than our art. So our art can sometimes end up, or our work can end up being a bit didactic, having the things in it that we feel like we want to say. Do you know what I mean? So that's why I think having a political context outside of the work is so important, because then it means the stuff that you're doing the work about is the stuff that you're less didactic about, the stuff that you understand less. Up on the screen is a shot from Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, that works as a kind of two-hander with a live Instagram connection. So that's one of our production shots. And I think that was about these big international questions. And I suppose my other frustration in terms of what's going on in political art at the minute, that's the artistic frustration. The political frustration is that perhaps I think, and it's not just an arts problem, I think the liberal left, if you like, progressive opinion, we still have some big problems, and I'm speaking as a mixed race person. Do you know what I mean? I'm not just saying white people. Do you know what I mean? But generally, progressive opinion, however progressive we are, there's still some level on which we think about the West and the rest. We're still quite Eurocentric in terms of how we think about the world. To be slightly provocative about it, there's a fantastic Indian writer, Indian political theorist called Partha Chatterjee, who wrote a book about the development of democratic struggles in India and China. And provocatively, he called it, because it's about India and China, he called the book Politics in Most of the World. And I think that we in the West, even leftists and progressives, have a long way to get to before we think in those terms. So just thinking about the relationship of art and politics, and that lack of like a good chunky sort of political understanding perhaps outside of art as well, I wanted to start with a really interesting example of the relationship between art and politics. I'll move on to the next slide to do that. So I want to go back about 40 years to the Iranian Revolution, and this first little video that Martin is going to show probably reflects the kind of cliched understanding of what was going on in Iran at that time. So we're just going to about a minute of archive footage, if that's all right.
Fundamentalism took hold with a fury and a force that helped ignite the still impoverished masses in Iran, who felt they had little reason to be grateful to the Shah. The fabulous profits from oil had not filtered down to them. Autumn 1978. Anti-Shah demonstrations had grown to such proportions that the Shah declared martial law in most of Iran's cities. The crowd shouted death to the Shah. Among the despised symbols of their monarch, the marchers raised pictures of the Shah's antagonist, the bearded, fierce-eyed holy man, Ayatollah Khomeini.
The preoccupation in Tehran still seems to be over whether the Shah would leave Iran once a new civilian government is formed.
From his exile in France, Khomeini was the chief fomenter, the mastermind, and eventually the inheritor of Iran's Islamic Revolution. The Shah secluded himself in his palace, surrounded only by friends, courtiers, and officers.
Hello. So like that's the way the West often thinks about the Iranian Revolution. But at the heart of one of the ways you can tell a story about the Iranian Revolution is a story of the relationship between arts and politics. I want to begin by briefly discussing, there's a very famous journalist, Polish journalist called Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote a series of amazing, he was like one of these kind of like 70s adventurer types that you don't really get anymore. He managed to sort of like randomly, as a journalist, find himself at these like world-beating, like world-changing moments. He was there when Haile Selassie fell in Addis Ababa. He was there in Tehran when the Shah fell. He was there when the Americans packed up in Vietnam. And Kapuscinski, in his book about the fall of the Shah, points to something that's kind of difficult to think about if you've grown up in the West, which is the genuine suffocating fear that comes of living in a real political dictatorship. So there's people on the streets are chanting "Death to the King, death to the King." Now, speaking personally, my father was arrested and tortured along with his friends by the Shah's secret police, and a few years before that, and he'd never said that stuff out loud, So Kapuscinski points out in his book, there must have been one moment when, for the first time, when these demonstrations were happening, there must have been one moment when the first person said "Death to the King." Like, that was something you could not say. That was something that if it was reported you'd said it, men in leather jackets and black masks would come around in the middle of the night and take you away. So the question becomes, what sense of reality gives people the sense of freedom to say that for the first time? So actually, in terms of the story of the Iranian Revolution, one thing that's often forgotten is what this slide speaks to, is the uprising at the Goethe Institute. In that slide, you see a picture of a poet and playwright called Said Sultanpour. And the Goethe Institute is that thing that the German government run all over the world, where they put money in it so you can go learn German and so on. In about 1978, so a year before the Iranian Revolution, a bunch of Iranian students basically, at the behest of, there was a slightly like left-wing German government that was talking about freedom of speech all over the world. So a bunch of Iranian students occupied the Goethe Institute in Tehran and refused to come out, and had a festival of plays and poetry led by this guy, Said Sultanpour. And what that festival was about performing and reciting all the poems and plays that they weren't allowed to do because of the secret police, which largely for them, funnily enough, meant loads of lefty German plays. So it didn't necessarily mean work that was like directly didactically talking about what was happening in Iran. It meant being able to do Brecht. It meant being able to do, a certain kind of Schiller or whatever. And this, basically, the secret police turned up outside the Goethe Institute and made it clear that they were going to beat people up as soon as they came outside. But more and more people gathered. And by the end of that week of nights, about 10,000 students were mobilized around the gardens of the Goethe Institute. And one of the ways of telling the story of the insurrection of Tehran is that those people basically never went home until the regime fell. So there's something really interesting there going on about the relationship between art and the struggle for democracy. And I think what's interesting is that way that the art and the struggle for democracy sit askance from each other, you can see in other things as well. Like, for instance, if you think about the relationship of like, the way commercial kind of R&B turns into soul at the same time as the civil rights movement, that's not necessarily people making specific songs about that struggle, but it's something happening at a similar sort of period. Ditto, you could talk about the explosion of reggae music at the same time as the rise to power of Michael Manley's leftist government in Jamaica. So in terms of what the big political questions are in the struggle we're looking at, the question becomes, what are the big political struggles of the 21st century? And one interesting thing for me, I think, is when we look at resistance in the global north. So look, we all know that we're living at a time where the idea of democracy isn't just up for debate again now. It's not something that everyone in the world thinks is a good thing. Let's be clear. Half of this country, half of the US, think that ethnic diversity, feminism, the internet, democracy, and freedom of speech are not good things, and they keep voting for people who explicitly say they don't think they're good things. And there's a resistance to that, which is largely led by younger, more ethnically diverse, more confident people. Now, I don't know how many folks, if we were in a room together, I could go, how many people recognize this picture? It came out of the big demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter in Portland recently. And I want to speak to this a little bit about how I think where the problems with our kind of international view is a little bit. So this was a woman who got the name of Naked Athena because, I don't know if you saw it, it went viral on the internet and people were saying, oh, she did naked yoga when the feds came to crack heads in Portland. She did naked yoga to like kind of stop the feds attacking her or the people or whatever. And she was met with a huge amount of contempt, quite a lot from the left, apart from anyone else. And people said, well, look, first of all, they spoke of cultural appropriation. They said, who is this woman, this white woman, do you know what I mean, who's doing this thing called naked yoga that no one's ever heard of before in the name of something, and actually like taking visibility away from black people who are doing the Black Lives Matter protest. However, all you have to do is dig into this a little bit. So there was a podcast led by some Black Lives Matter folks in Portland who this woman anonymously came on and spoke about who she is and why she did this thing. She's a performance artist who gets naked all the time. She's also a sex worker. She's also, in the American context, a woman of color and a woman of an immigrant background and a background that ain't white. And she wasn't doing yoga. She wasn't doing yoga. She never claimed to be doing yoga. In fact, basically what she said was, as someone who does a lot of kind of performance art where she gets naked, she felt that the cultural appropriation at work was, she said she saw all these white guys dressed up in, with weapons and armor, puffing themselves up, she said, like the warriors who used to live on this soil before the white people came. And she said she found that very, very offensive. Do you know what I mean? And she thought about what was the one thing in her practice and her tactics that she had to like stop people dead in their tracks. And that was to like strip off, basically. She's also, when she's kind of like showing herself full frontally there, a few hours before she was beaten by the police. So one of the things we don't see in this photo is that she's being kind of like struck by stuff. And there are marks where she's been beaten by the police earlier. So that's part of the thing that she's doing in terms of her resistance there. So I think it's very interesting when we talk about, when I was saying what are the problems politically that we're missing, this is another example of how we're not properly international. We tell ourselves we are, but really we're just looking at the surface level of stuff internationally. And one of the problems is we are importing from America, which is a country a lot more like ours, let's say, than Syria or China or the other place in terms of being part of the global north. We're importing these ideas of kind of cultural appropriation, being a person of color, being this, a way of talking about race and a way of talking about the struggle against racism that we're just bringing the surface level over of. So it's interesting just in passing to think about, you know, I'm someone, as I say, I'm a mixed race background myself. I'm, you know, some people nowadays would say, would describe me as being like, you know, light skinned, or some people might even use the phrase white passing, which I always think is a really fucking weird phrase because it depends where you are, do you know what I mean? And how people are looking at you. But the point is even that phrase, people of color, I remember that coming over to the UK and us starting to use that as like, okay, that's definitely an unproblematic phrase to be used now. But then I did a bit of research into it and I found out that actually the roots of the phrase people of color comes in the US from a way of describing, basically a way of describing the way that slavery, you know, in the antebellum South, the way that lighter skinned African-American people were talked about in terms of their relationship with the brutal subjection of slavery. So it comes from actually being defined by white people at a certain time. And again, I just think I think in terms of how we are international, to have a genuinely international view of politics, to have genuine solidarity with each other, we need to have some real substantial, finely grained discussions about the ways in which we're similar and the ways in which we're different, which takes us to the other big thing that we need to be thinking politically about now, which is being with the wretched of the earth. I use that phrase advisedly, obviously from Frantz Fanon's very famous book. You know, I think if we look at where the big humanitarian crises are in the world, where people are struggling at the point of the harshest part of the struggle against racism and the harshest part of the struggle for democracy, we see a number of countries. I mean, you know, you could make your own list here, but it seems to me fairly sensible to talk about Syria and what's happened there. You know, this magnificent revolution of the dispossessed, drowned in blood. To talk about China and the struggle of the Uyghur people, to talk about Yemen, and to talk about the heritage of the brutal civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And again, I think where we've got a slight sort of like woolliness of thinking in a lot of the chats we're having about race and democracy at the minute, is people are talking about phrases like, so this might be a little bit controversial. I'm up for a discussion about this, but like people are talking about like kind of I think people, you know, people are talking about the need to decolonize the world as if that would be something that starts now. But the point is that, you know, decolonization as a process began in the 60s and has happened in a super problematic way. So that quote there is from Achille Mbembe, who's an incredible Francophone West African cultural theorist and post-colonial theorist. And he said, in the colonies, the sovereign might, this is how he described colonial violence. In the colonies, the sovereign might kill at any time or in any manner. Colonial warfare is not subject to legal and institutional rules. It's not a legally codified activity. Instead, colonial terror constantly intertwines with colonially generated fantasies of wilderness and death, and these fictions work together to make something real. Now, my point would be this: we all know, as people of so-called people of color, we all know that our struggle against racism in the global north is bound with the struggle for freedom in the global south. We know that in our hearts and our bones, and the kind of topics that we seek to organize around. But in that description of colonial violence, I would ask people to think about that list of Syria, China, Yemen, and Congo, and just think about how that thing that goes, the warfare which is not subject to legal and institutional rules, the lack of a legally codified activity, the colonial terror, these things now are, as likely to be, they are being exercised and pursued with a severity by Arabs and Africans and Chinese people that frankly 100 years ago would have made the white original colonists blush. So there's a much more finely grained argument we have to be beginning to have here, which from my point of view really is just a plea for internationalism, is for us to not make the global south a place that only exists to support our arguments with each other. And ultimately, this is, I suppose, this is my provocation here. When I say, why is it that we find these grotesque human rights abuses in the global north, like, state-sanctioned police murder in the US, or the Grenfell fire, or, what one could think of as ethnic cleansing in London? Why do we find them so grotesque? And I think clearly we find them so grotesque because we get a glimmer of, in the global north, what like is like for, to be clear, the broad masses of the people in the global south. So that's another little plea for internationalism as an important part of our artistic practice and political practice. So what might this kind of art look like that speaks to democracy in this way and speaks to kind of that kind of political view in this way? So one of the bits of work that I find really inspiring, one of the artists I find really inspiring at the minute is a guy called Theaster Gates. He's an incredible African-American artist who sits sort of between theatre, visual art, architecture, and kind of community regeneration. One of his first kind of famous bits of work was a piece called Plate Convergences. Now, what you can see in this, let me just find my notes very quickly, sorry. Yeah, what you can see in this picture is part of this installation piece. So Plate Convergences was a kind of historical, or if you're almost like a sort of slightly heritage bit of work that Gates did about the relationship between African American and Japanese culture. And he built an internationalism that was absolutely about specificity and finely grained knowledge. I think for me, critically looking at this, there's a very interesting thing about white supremacy and kind of like white-centric, Eurocentric power structures, where often what they do, what happens from a white vantage point is the white figure, the white man, is put in the center, is the reasonable place in the center. And then different non-white peoples become the extremes at either side. And clearly in American culture, there is very definitely a kind of a racist spectrum in which white Americans are in the middle and Black Americans on one side, Asian Americans are the other. People talk about the model minority issue for Asian Americans, or, perhaps you might think of the famous sexual stereotypes about Black men on one side and Asian women on the other, and this kind of question. And Theaster Gates makes this incredible intervention in this. What he finds is these plates that are made by a Japanese ceramicist who moved from Japan to the US in the 1970s and married in Chicago a Black civil rights activist. And contrary to this racist idea that Japanese culture and Black American culture are opposite to each other, this artist, in his life and in the mixed race children he was having, he saw surprising parallels. And so, for instance, he built all these kinds of ceramics, which is specifically built for serving traditional African-American soul food in them rather than Japanese food in them. and Theaster Gates, whose work sort of celebrates this guy's life, up to and including inviting the mixed race son of these two artists and activists to speak about their experience together. Now, of course, the twist is that none of this actually happened, and Theaster Gates has made the whole thing up to sort of make this point. And in fact, there's a brilliant sort of like the punchline bit of visual art to this project was this fantastic poster as a kind of response to who had actually made those things. But for me, that kind of work is absolutely inspiring when I think about what is a thing that is genuinely kind of like anti-racist, in that sense that it's engaging with a specificity and a cleverness with who the global majority is, and in that way it's democratic. I think what makes this artistic is a very kind of specific set of things. I think how that's, if I can say two more things, I think time-wise I've probably got about 5 more minutes. Is that right? I think, Luke, would you, yeah, I'd say about that sort of thing. I would say, you know, what is the fundamental artistic kind of provocation for me is this: as a theatre maker, what is it that I do for a living? As a theatre maker, I make collective subjectivities. That's what I do. That's what we do in theatre. That's what we do in performance. Now, we might do that unconsciously. We might not care that we're doing that. We might do that in an incredibly fucking boring way, and that collective subjectivity might just be everyone looking forward to a Solero or a gin and tonic at half time. But nevertheless, that's what we're doing. And the big question of anti-racism and democracy in this country at the minute is the question of what is the new political subjectivity, the new social subjectivity that can push that forward. In the 20th century, you pays your money, you takes your choice. If you're a Marxist, you think the working class are going to take us forward. If you're a Maoist, you think the third world peasantry is going to take us forward. If you're a radical feminist, you think women are waking up to the truth of the patriarchy is going to take us forward. Long story short, none of that worked. So we need a new answer to that. And when I think about what that collective subjectivity might be, and what it means to be a member of the people who are raced and classed in a certain way in this country, and I speak very specifically thinking about the context in which we're having these very, very, you know, how do you say, short-tempered discussions about whether we say BAME or people of colour or this kind of stuff. Listen, let me say this to you. I know who my people are when I look through that list of names of people that exist, that is accessible, who died in the Grenfell fire, which is Iranians, which is Arabs, which is African Caribbeans, which is Bangladeshis, which is Pakistanis, which is many other people from different parts of the world who share that heritage in colonialism and the struggle for democracy. Finally, I'll just leave you some thoughts from this manifesto we've been drawing up as a bit, if that's interesting. And the headlines are, this was going to be available online soon. So I think what I'm arguing is that I'm trying to make theatre which holds the following things are true. First of all, every work we make should say something that speaks directly but askance about contemporary politics, by which we mean the most fundamental questions: the global gap between the rich and poor, the struggle for democracy, the ongoing climate emergency, and the struggle against racism. 2, every project should be distributed in a way that speaks formally to the question that we're asking. The work we make is not just limited to things that happen on stage. They're about relationships between people and building new subjectivities. Some work has and will meet its final product as something staged, but the collective thought, research, and activity that goes into it is just as crucial. It happens that a mobile phone, a Wi-Fi connection, and a play were the best ways to document some of our plays, but others might take other forms. 3, there has to be an equity of access for artists, participants, and audiences. This is kind of boring stuff, but this one, but we have to build at least 51% of all of those categories have to be Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, because our overarching aim is to decenter whiteness and make work that represents the international reality. Aside from the violence, death, and misery that it brings, racism and the wages of empire make us stupid and boring. But the answer to this isn't only representational. It's about reappropriating and moving beyond colonial stereotypes. 4, every one of our projects will think specifically about what kind of people are missing from the conversation and bring them in. 5, every project we make will have an international collaboration at the heart of it. 6, every project should contribute to the new infrastructure that a new way of making theatre needs. And 7, everything we do has to be fun. So that's my set of provocations about art and democracy. Thank you for listening to me rabbit on. I'm aware that's kind of like a bunch of kind of vaguely related things, but it's just really nice to be invited to this kind of space, which I hope in the spirit of the brilliant times I've had at Pervasive Media Studio speaks that kind of like inquiry and just trying to fucking work some stuff out together. So thank you.
Javad, thank you so much. I think every time I listen to you, I feel like I've been educated by at least another 5 years in a very short space of time. Where the questions are starting to flow in, and I think what I wanted to kind of like to kick it off with was just to say, we're talking about COVID because we're in it, right? COVID is happening. That's the world we live in at the moment, and the phrase "new normal" keeps being thrown around. Like how does a manifesto like this come to life in a world that's kind of underpinned by COVID-19?
I think I would say two things about that. One is I think what I sometimes think with the COVID question, like a friend of mine who is much older and wiser said to me something that I quite enjoyed. Well, he said in passing, we were having a drink together over Zoom as you do. And he went, the funny thing is, he goes, think about the history books in 100 years time. He said, I know what they'll say. They'll say what all history books always do. Like if you look at the Antonine plagues at the end of the Roman Empire, the history books always say, of course, all the plague really did was bring out what was already a social problem in the society. And it kind of looked like that. So in terms of, and we see that really, in terms of like the local lockdowns and stuff that are happening, you can see the place, you know, where what COVID is bringing out is people with largely people from the global south in dreadful working conditions with shit housing. Do you know what I mean? The same questions that Grenfell was bringing out. I think in terms of how this practically fits into the manifesto we're building, it's about, look, if you are an artist who's coming from a non-traditional background and making work which isn't traditional theatre, you need to be in a position of insurgency. You need to have momentum. And the big challenge we have at the minute is this, that the people far, far above my pay grade who've got this £1.5 billion from the government, I've told a story which is true and which is useful for a certain kind of institution, which says, look, we need to mothball things and we need to press pause until all this is over. But companies like mine, you know, us are seen. We don't want that pressing pause, just presses pause on the institutional inequality that keeps us where we are. So what this manifesto is helping us do is go, listen, man, we're just going to try and produce some work, and it's not all going to be digital. And it is going to be, we are going to try and make it safe, and we are going to try and make it in a way that people don't feel nervous and so on, you know, to put themselves at risk. But, you know, we don't run a theatre, so let's just try and produce some things, you know?
And a question, thank you. A question that's come in from the chat is what the manifesto covered a number of things in the talk as well. Obviously, like where do you sit in terms of digital freedoms, privacy rights, and the kind of conversation on that in the context of making work that sits potentially in a digital sphere?
I think it's difficult. I think there is like, you know, it's there are a lot of deals to be made with the devil. Do you know what I mean? And there's a lot of, you know, I think one of the backgrounds you and I share, Luke, is a background in kind of a certain kind of activism, a certain kind of a leftist, like kind of far leftist activism. And I think, you know, you start to make some, as soon as you sort of start to struggle for a slightly bigger platform and perhaps a little bit more, dare I say it, power to put your ideas into practice, there always comes a payoff. I think I have a lot of time, and probably knowing the PM Studio vibe, there are probably people with a much more contemporary understanding of this. But I think on that political level, I still remain really, I think Negri's writing about like the commons and the kind of recommoning of information and the knowledge economy is something that still speaks to me very, very strongly. I think the challenge with that is like basically not just putting yourself up as sacrifice to bigger people. Do you know what I mean? And so really it's a question for me of autonomy. Those are the reforms we need to be making. Like, how can we build the autonomy we need to be in charge of the work we want to do and the distribution of the work that we want in the way we want to make it? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's a couple more questions coming through, but I want to bounce that around a little bit more. What do you think where does autonomy sit in an arts world that's kind of predicated on a need, if you will, for kind of bricks and mortar institution?
Well, I mean, look, to be clear, man, autonomy, one of the first places that autonomy sits is cash money. I mean, let's be clear. Like, in terms of like, whilst the arts were pulling itself apart about diversity, grime just happened and people just made it happen and made a ton of money. And now everyone wants to invite them to the table. Do you know what I mean? So like, it's about alternative models of infrastructure. Now, I'm being slightly facetious when I say it's just about cash. It's not. It's about the infrastructure and the leverage that cash makes possible. The question is like, what shape can infrastructure and leverage take? And I think we are seeing, there are different models of that. And so Theaster Gates is a really, really interesting example, man. So Theaster built one of his projects is he built in Chicago. So Chicago's got like massively like just, crapped on neighborhoods, do you know what I mean? Which are 2 seconds away from being gentrified. And he built these like incredible like kind of community spaces, which have children's play areas, are in like old warehouses and stuff, children's play areas, artist studios, and actually look beautiful, brings his architectural practice into the work. And you go, hang on a second, that's primed for gentrification, surely. But he built into that a way of making it not be gentrified. So he had those, so basically he's made himself the collector of African-American artistic heritage in Chicago. So for instance, when Frankie Knuckles, the founder of house music, died, he left his huge vinyl collection to Theaster Gates, which is now archived in one of these artist spaces. So that space is technically a heritage space and a museum space. So like he's worked with like legal people, so that like you can't gentrify it. Do you know what I mean? Like the law says. So there are these little crazy models of what infrastructure might look like, I think.
Great, thank you. Owen Assels asks, in your manifesto, you spoke about investigating voices, which voices aren't currently included in the conversation, and bring them in. How do you go about creating that collaboration?
I think that's a really good question, man. I think the challenges are about making that commitment central to your artistic vision. That's the way of doing that. So like, for instance, if I go, the world has to see my Chekhov. Do you know what I mean? The world has to see my Chekhov. Where is that, for the sake of argument, where is the half Iranian, half Bangladeshi, a blind person who I've not worked with before? Let's say whatever, being facetious. Where is this specific box ticking exercise that I can put into this thing? That's never going to get us where we want to be. But thinking about who the interesting people are and what those collaborations look like, and then allowing that to filter into the actual artistic program. And then obviously it's my job as an artistic director of a company to give that some coherence and to give that some drive and to bring that together. But to kind of upend the traditional way that works, I think is a really crucial part of that.
Well, Owen is one of your fellow studio residents, so hopefully the two of you can link up and carry that conversation on. Fast Familiar asks, the internet offers us new ways to be international, but also seems to give us spaces which let us be the worst versions of ourselves. Any thoughts on that, and how can artists engage with it? I mean, you've got some experience of this with the Believers Are But Brothers, right?
Yeah. Well, I feel like the one answer to that is like, we're showing the interactive film version of Believers Are But Brothers at Electric Dreams Festival this week. So you would be very, very welcome to go check that out, because I say that basically that's what that show's about. It's pretty bleak, to be honest, but there we are. I think, look, I'm not going to sit here and legislate for stuff. I don't think that I am of the belief and the persuasion that, dare I say it, intellectuals, artists, activists, we're not in charge of how history works. Do you know what I mean? Like, kind of social struggles and waves of people are in charge of how history works. And I would just say what's interesting is to do that research and look at those ways in which people are using this stuff in really interesting ways. We can talk about this kind of, you think about the waves of this chat, like, think about back in 2011, 2012, and the breathless way that Facebook and Twitter were bringing down dictatorships in the Middle East. Then fast forward 5-6 years, and Facebook and Twitter are bringing Trump to power in the US. Do you know what I mean? And obviously different things are at work there. One of the things that I find most inspiring at the minute about how people are using that stuff is Bellingcat. If people know Bellingcat, the investigative journalists that work online, brutal forensic investigative journalists. Because what I find specifically inspirational about Bellingcat is that they do the thing that you're not supposed to be able to do on the internet. Do you know what I mean? In terms of like the stereotypes understanding. So, you know, even progressive things that happen on the internet, we sometimes think of sort of like finely grained truth as being collateral damage of that. Do you know what I mean? So like, for instance, when the Me Too movement happened, do you know what I mean? Obviously, I almost felt like, you know, I almost felt like we were going like, we had to put up with like a lack of finely grained analysis because at least some good broad things were happening. Do you know what I mean? But the interesting thing about Bellingcat is they specifically have managed to kind of bring together, by sharing knowledge and by sharing tech, a way of just forensically taking apart the propaganda and bullshit of the Putin-Trump alliance. And it's beautiful to watch. So when you remember in January, February, the Iranian regime, dreadful crime, the Iranian regime shot down one of their own passenger jets when it was flying over Iran. And it was a dreadful crime for all kinds of reasons, mainly because basically, obviously, the Americans had attacked Iranian troops in Iraq, and the Iranians wanted to sort of show their people that they would stand up to the Americans. And effectively what it looks like is they shot down this plane and then wanted to tell their people that the Americans had done it. And immediately, these kinds of like thoughtless, pseudo-leftist, you know, Putinist morons kind of jump into life on the internet. People are going like, yeah, well, you know, it's fake news. It wasn't the Iranians that did it. It was the Americans. But within literally 16 hours, some random who happened to be in the bit of Iranian Kurdistan where the plane came down had a video of it on their phone, which got sent to someone who knows how to, like, you know, put that into like a GPS thing, which sent it to someone who knows how to make, you know, how flight lines work, which sent it to someone who knows how you can read a map and find out where Iranian missile bases are. And within like literally 18 hours, you had like a forensic account of this of a quality that you can literally submit to the United Nations. And I just think what an incredible organization. Do you know what I mean? And they're doing all this stuff, like they do this incredible work, like for instance, it's quite expensive because a lot of journalists want their skills. So you can go on a course that costs about $5,000 and they just teach you how to geek out like this over 4 days. But then you're a member of their network. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, blah, blah, blah. I'm a big fan of Bellingcat. There you go.
Question from Twitter. Someone's asking, kind of like the digital space is a space for kind of debate, but it's majorly covered with trolls.
Yeah.
Engage or don't engage?
When we toured to University of Michigan, I was lucky enough to speak with we obviously in America, you go to a lot of the, you know, the universities have a lot of money to bring artists in. So we went to the University of Michigan, had a really great time, met this absolutely incredible guy called Clifford Lampard, which is a fantastically American name, who is like a leading scholar of the kind of psychological anthropology of online trolling. And as part of his research, he is a notorious online troll, where he basically like, so he spends a lot of time in kind of like the men's rights movement and amongst the kind of people who are trolling women through Gamergate, and kind of understands what makes them tick, and then has all these sock puppet accounts he uses to try and pull them the other way. Do you know what I mean? Super interesting guy. I think what that makes clear to me when I think about that stuff is that, like, look, you know, maybe it's just being an old-fashioned leftist, like fight, you know, in the immortal words of Sun Tzu, fight only when you are certain of victory. Like, these are different spaces with different rules. I think, like, I often think one of the mistakes we make as progressives at the minute is the idea that we're going to win everyone over to our politics immediately. We're not. In this country, let's take the issue of immigration. About a third of people in this country are just massive racists and think it's terrible and the whole thing should be stopped. And they are prepared to lose money. They are perfectly prepared that their life gets worse, but they're more white people, basically, proportionally. There's about a third in the middle that will go either way. And there's about a third of progressive people who think, on a point of principle, immigration is a good thing, yeah? Now, the problem is, those guys who think it's always a bad thing on a point of principle, they're really confident. They keep winning. Do you know what I mean? They keep winning. And I think we get trapped in this thing where we go, we want to convince everyone and get a majority. But our first job is to unite the people closest to us, is to give ourselves confidence and get us to feel that we've got the same weight they've got. Then our second job is to make the case and pull over these people in the middle. And frankly, our third job is to isolate those people, to beat them in our politics. Do you know what I mean? Not to win them to our politics. Some people just are a bit horrible. Do you know what I mean? Like, and there's no, you can't convince everyone, but you can try and beat them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with that. Rosanna Diaz asks, you spoke about needing a new collective subjectivity. Can you tell us a bit more about what that means to you?
I think I'm probably using that in quite a technical way. Specifically, I'm thinking of the great like headline acts, so to speak, of radical politics in the late 19th and early 20th century. So obviously, there is all the way through human history, there has been, this is a stupidly wide-ranging thing to say, but you can say all the way through human history, there has been people fighting for something like social justice and something like freedom, Specifically, and what's interesting about the 19th and 20th centuries is that we get a series of theories and analyses that claim to find a connection between that political commitment and some actually existing people. Do you know what I mean? So the most famous example would be Marxism, obviously, and communism, that kind of Marxist communism. And obviously the Marxist communist position is that capitalism is this crazy, crazy system that does all kinds of things, some of which are good, some of which are bad. But one thing it just objectively does is creates this class of people called the working class or the proletariat, who Marx would say, by their very nature, as soon as they realize what their true interests are, will overthrow this system and take us to socialism. And so that was like a collective subject, and it came with all these attendant ideas, some of which panned out to be true, some of which panned out to be false. Like the idea that, for instance, that collective subjectivity of working in a factory together, of working in a big, or in the docks together, in a big place of work, is one of the things that drove the trade union movement in its kind of heroic period in England from the 1890s to the 1960s. People had to come in together, do their work together, and you see like that collective subjectivity getting expanded as more women get access to those places of work and those struggles. Some of the sexism and chauvinism of those men is softened or challenged. In the same way, you see a big uptick in white anti-racism. When Asians first came to this country in the north of England, there was racial shift work. So in the mills of Bradford and Manchester and so on, white English people worked the day, Irish people worked the evening, and then blacks and Asians worked overnight for less money. And when that started to get dismantled, you saw people working together and more of a sense of solidarity. So that would be like a collective subjectivity. And kind of by extension, other big political theories of the 19th and late 19th, early and 20th century had similar subjectivities. So because we kept waiting for, the Marxists kept waiting for the European working class to bring us to socialism, and it just, obviously, spoiler, it didn't happen. So certain leftists influenced more by Mao Zedong and by people like Joseph and Nkrumah or Frantz Fanon in the third world, they started saying then, okay, well, that group of people, that collective subjectivity that's being born, that necessarily, as it comes to know itself, will move us forwards into freedom, is the masses of people in the third world struggling against colonialism. Again, spoiler, they struggled against colonialism. Formally, a lot of those countries, in fact, all of those countries, apart from probably Palestine, are formally free of colonialism now. And actually, we didn't get there. Do you know what I mean? Again, and if you read that classic radical feminist, amazing radical feminist stuff of the 70s, your Shillama Firestones, your people like that. Again, a similar argument is made about women as a collective subjectivity. Again, a whole bunch of amazing struggle happens, but we don't get there. So that's kind of what I mean. Do you know what I mean?
Thank you. We're nearly out of time. If anyone wants to squeeze another question in, you have about 5 minutes. I'm going to roll another one to Javad, and we'll see if anything else pops into the chat. You can tweet us questions as well on @PM Studio UK if you can't comment in the chat right now. Javad, so you like with COVID and like a lot of other theatre makers saw a lot of best laid plans kind of laying to some sort of form of waste and cancellation. Like, what's it been like? The kind of the reimagining you've been pushed to do for example, with the Rich Kids of Tehran, but now also the Believers Are Brothers. What's that been like as a process as a director and maker?
I think it's been frustrating, and it's also been exciting. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we worked together for a long time, and like, you know, I'm someone who likes to be doing new things, and I like to be doing things. Do you know what I mean? And sort of there's quite a lot of ideas on the burn at any one time, and I think so. The frustration came of feeling like you're sort of trapped somewhere trying to re-evolve something. Actually, in terms of the making the digital version of Rich Kids, which again is on Electric Genius Festival, you know, available from all good outlets, all that kind of thing. Folks should have a look because we're very proud of it. Like, we actually ended up making a thing that we're very, very proud of. And I think there was some interesting, having done a bit of filmmaking and done theatre, the big sort of note for me was to try and not make something that looks like a shit film with no budget. And I think we've really, really managed to do that. And I think a lot of people, we were playing with the form of these things that we're doing, you know, the way we talk nowadays and stuff. And I think the big challenge for me is about going with a rush to do stuff online. The big challenge was just, again, a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of bullshit. 70% of our workforce are freelancers. Do you know what I mean? Like, look, I watched a bunch of National Theatre and Shelby and stuff, and I caught up and I did my homework, and I genuinely took a benefit from that. Yeah, so cool. And I'm not hammering that stuff. But that stuff being online is kind of leverage for an argument about support at that level for those institutions, which, to be clear, is not going to help anyone make a living who isn't tied to those institutions in quite a powerful way. And so what I'm really keen that we're starting to do now with Manifesto and stuff is to go, look, how do we make theatre now? You know, and that means the best, you know, plans will still have, you know, one of the things on the books is we try to make an international co-production happen. So, you know, well, two actually. So we'll see how that pans out, man. But you've got to sort of start going for, do you know what I mean? To see how you need to morph and mutate. Do you know what I mean? Whether that means more stuff happens in non-theatre spaces. Amazing, do you know what I mean?
Great, thank you. I think unless we haven't got any more questions, so we're going to draw it to a close. Javad, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us on this sweltering day in England. For those of you who've maybe just tuned in, you are able to see this talk again. It will be available with a recorded and captioned version of the talk live from this link shortly after we finish. Next week's talk is, well, again, actually, there is no talk next week as we're taking a well-earned week off, and we'll be back on the 14th of August at 1 p.m. Here on the Watershed YouTube channel with a talk called Can Games Be Serious by studio resident Claire Morwood and Chella Ramanan of Threefold Games, who will be introducing their recently released video game Before I Forget, a short narrative exploration about a woman suffering from early onset dementia. You can get news on all our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. The next 3 talks are on our website, so you can check out all the ones that are coming up over the rest of the month of August. Don't forget, before you go, please do hit subscribe on this YouTube channel and give the video a thumbs up or one or the other. Everything you do in that respect helps us to share more stories like this. Please feel free to share the link to the talk. It will be available here for as long as the YouTube channel is up. And if you have your own idea for a lunchtime talk, you can drop us a line and let us know what you want to talk about. Details for how to do that are on our website. Thank you very much for watching. We're going to take a week off now, and we will see you on the 14th of August.